Alors, à l'ordre, bonjour et bienvenue à la 7e réunion du Comité des
Je
affaires
voudrais aviser
autochtones
Monsieur le
et du
Président, mais
Nord.
les interprètes me mentionnent que le son n'est pas bon pour l'interprétation.
Mr. Chair, I'm so sorry to interrupt.
Yeah, no, it's my fault.
I apologize. It was my fault. I was connected to my printer instead of to my microphone. Alors, bonjour tout le monde. On commence la réunion.
Hello, everyone. We're going to start the meeting. So welcome to the 7th meeting of the Standing Committee on Indigenous and Northern Affairs.
Unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe Nation. Aujourd'hui, on commence.
Today, we will start our second study on the effect of the housing crisis on Indigenous peoples in Canada. To start the discussion, we are happy to welcome the Minister of Crown Indigenous Relations, the Honourable Mark Miller, and his staff, and the Minister of Indigenous Services, the Honourable Patty Haidu, as well as her staff, and Patricia Rosette Zupa, Vice President, Policy Development at the Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation. There will then be a second panel in the second hour. We will be happy to welcome
Receiving national and regional Indigenous organizations in the second hour. Regional Chief Cindy Woodhouse of the Assembly of First Nations, Nathan Obed, President of the Inuit Tapiriit Kanatami, as well as Chef Lance Aymon de l'Assemblée des Premières Nations.
Of the Assembly of First Nations of Quebec and Labrador. For those of you in the room, I know that you understand public health measures. I will not repeat them.
We follow in these committee meetings. So in order to maximize our time, without further ado, I would invite Minister Haidu to take the floor. And Minister, you have 5 minutes.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And I am happy.
This morning, I am physically on the Robinson Superior Treaty Territory area in the homeland of Fort William First Nation. Of course, contributions by many Métis people over the years. And I'm very honored to be speaking to the committee today. And I'm thrilled that you're conducting this study on the ability for people, Indigenous people, to have adequate, safe, and affordable housing. It's an absolute necessity for the work of reconciliation, for the safety, security, and in fact, economic development and prosperity of Indigenous peoples. Unfortunately, successive governments have not prioritized housing for Indigenous peoples, and as a result, Indigenous peoples are more likely to live in overcrowded homes and experience higher rates of all kinds of challenges, including mold and other poor housing conditions. Le recensement de la population de 2016 estime.
So we estimate that about half of Indigenous people live in housing that need repairs, and only a third of the general population live in similar housing. Research has also demonstrated that Indigenous people living on reserve are 8 times more at risk than non-Indigenous people to live in overpopulated housing.
Adequate and safe housing is connected to building healthier and more prosperous communities. And without a safe place to call home, inadequate housing affects children and families, and it makes them more likely to experience respiratory problems. They have a higher risk of contracting infectious diseases like tuberculosis, COVID-19, and of course, the ongoing mental health challenges that are exacerbated by crowded living. I've heard many examples of how inadequate housing has affected Indigenous people, and leaders from coast to coast bring this up as one of the top issues that their communities are facing. But this is not a new situation. I'm thrilled that my mandate from the Prime Minister asks me to make immediate and long-term investments to close the housing gap by 2030. And I ask the members of this committee to support the government as we prepare to move to do this crucial work. The government is working with Indigenous partners on long-term approaches to ongoing current gaps and to addressing housing challenges. In August 2021, the Assembly of First Nations and the Institute for Fiscal Studies and Democracy released a joint study that identified the need for housing in First Nations communities at about 55,000 new units and 81,000 renovations on reserve. To close that gap by 2030, the government is committed to providing immediate and sustained funding for housing on First Nations. And working together with First Nations partners to co-develop the National First Nations Housing and Related Infrastructure Strategy. This plan was endorsed by the Assembly of First Nations Chiefs in 2018, and I'm committed to working with the Assembly of First Nations towards the advancement and implementation of the strategy. Through the implementation of this strategy, First Nations access to sustainable housing will be increased in a way that meets their needs and priorities, respects regional and cultural differences, and supports the transition to First Nations care, control, and management of housing based on their capacity, their prioritization. By both organizations play complementary roles in addressing housing needs on reserves. While ISC handles funding directed towards capital infrastructure, loan guarantees, housing innovation, and capacity building, CMHC focuses on social housing and renovations. I'm also working with my cabinet colleagues to implement the Inuit Nunavut housing strategy and the Métis housing subaccord. And I'm working with the Minister of Crown Indigenous Relations, the Minister of Housing and Diversity and Inclusion, and the Minister of Northern Affairs on the co-development of a Northern, Urban, and Rural Indigenous housing strategy. The government has made a number of important investments to ameliorate the need for housing in Indigenous communities and for Indigenous peoples. Since 2016 and as of September 30th, 2021, the government has supported construction and repair of homes for First Nations households and communities on reserve. And this includes building 7,873 new homes and the repair of well over 15,000. The figures don't include the units that are funded through the National Housing Strategy and its programs. En plus, les deux nouvelles constructions et rénovations, SAISA,
and nous avons entretenu plusieurs lots. We finished 1,300 out of them. And in Budget 2021, we announced new investments to improve infrastructure, including housing.
Financially support First Nations communities to build 800 new homes, renovate 2,000 housing units, and ensure that 500 additional lots are being serviced. We know these kinds of investments make a huge difference in the lives of families and individuals. Mr. Chair, as I said in my opening remarks, this is a very important study that you will be conducting, and the work that the government is doing with First Nations and Indigenous people is just a start. The need is great. You will hear that from witnesses, and there is much more to do. But this government is committed to making the investments to reach the 2030 goal and close the housing gap for Indigenous people. Miigwech, Nakumek, Masi, thank you, merci.
Thank you very much, Minister Hajdu. I'll now pass the microphone to Minister Miller. Minister Miller, you have 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. Kwekwe Tanse Unusakut. It's not morning anymore. Good afternoon. Et bonjour. I want to acknowledge that I am on the traditional territory of the Algonquin people here today, coming to you from Ottawa. Nice to see you in person again. Thanks for this invitation to such an important issue. La crise du logement à laquelle sont confrontés les peuples.
The housing crisis is one of the most important in the country for Indigenous people. We know that overpopulated, inadequate housing remains a key factor in the persistent physical health, mental health, and other social and economic challenges faced in these communities. In Inuit Nunavut, close to 52% of Inuit live in overcrowded homes. With all the impacts on health, namely tuberculosis and more recently COVID, this situation is unacceptable. We know that we must work harder and faster to close this gap and support our partners in the work that they do to make sure that everyone has access to a safe and clean living environment. Donc, nous avons travaillé avec des organisations et des ministères pour mettre en place la stratégie de logement pour les Inuit Nunavut. Et cette stratégie permet d'apporter
play a direct role in the delivery of housing in Inuit Nunangat. To support its implementation, we've committed to $13.2 billion through, in particular, the National Housing Co-Investment Fund in part. De plus, depuis 2000.
Moreover, since 2016, we have committed $490 million to support Inuit-led housing in Nunavik, Nunatsiavut, and the Inuvialuit region, along with repairs to many existing units. These investments will result in close to 500 new units constructed in these regions by the end of 2022. And so in the 2021 budget, we have funded infrastructure in Inuit Nunangat.
We invested $331 million to help 2,962 households access safe and secure housing. We've also provided $25 million to the government of Nunavut to support their immediate housing and infrastructure needs, as well as $10 million to create an estimated 24 new affordable homes in Nunavut since 2016. As well, we established an intergovernmental task force to respond to the critical housing and infrastructure needs in Nunavut. We also continue to play an active role through co-development and implementation of other distinctions-based approaches to housing and infrastructure, including the Métis Nation housing strategy through the work at Modern Treaty and self-governing First Nations tables as well. To support Métis Nation housing infrastructure, we committed in budget 2018 $500 million over 10 years. With this funding, Métis partners built or bought 1,158 housing units, repaired or renovated 2,096 housing units, and provided annual rental supports and subsidies, importantly, for 7,584 housing units. Since 2016, we've also committed $18 million for Northern First Nation and Métis communities in Northwest Territories, as well as an additional $25 million for the Northwest Territories to support their immediate housing and infrastructure needs. We've also established a dedicated intergovernmental task force to respond to the critical housing infrastructure needs in the Northwest Territories. Now, in Yukon, housing and infrastructure needs are determined by each self-governing Yukon First Nation, and their efforts have resulted notably in the building of 90 units and 13 new developed lots of water main project, energy efficiency upgrades to existing housing, and community-based infrastructure.
We'll continue to work with our Indigenous partners to find the best solutions to this crisis by directly supporting approaches that are Indigenous-based in a spirit of co-developing our policies. So thank you for giving me the opportunity to testify today, and I am ready for your questions.
Thank you very much, Minister Miller. We'll now turn to Patricia Rozet-Zupa, Vice President, Policy Development, Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation. Ms. Rozet-Zupa, you have 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation to contribute to this important study. Il me fait plaisir de
I'm happy to be here today in the name of to represent the Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation. Je me joins à vous aujourd'hui d'Ottawa sur le territoire traditionnel non cédé des peuples algonquins Anishinaabe. Je suis empli de gratitude pour cette terre et du respect et de l'appréciation pour ces nombreuses générations d'intendants. La SCHL et l'Agence nationale du logement du Canada, nous sommes guidés par une aspiration audacieuse voulant que d'ici 2030, tout le monde au Canada ait une maison abordable et qui réponde à ses besoins.
We're doing this in part by delivering.
Monsieur le Président, l'interprétation ne fonctionne pas.
Sorry, Mr. Speaker, Madame Gill would like to intervene.
Yes, I just heard Madame Gill say that the interpretation is not working. Can we check IT with Ms. Rozet-Zupa to see if she's properly configured?
Mr. Chair, I'm told that it's working now.
Okay, all right, then excuse the delay. We'll resume, Ms. Rozet-Zupa.
Pas de problème, merci. So CMHC is Canada's national housing agency. We are guided by a bold aspiration that by 2030, everyone in Canada has a home that they can afford.
Monsieur le Président, je m'excuse, nous avons perdu l'interprète.
Okay, all right. Well, we'll just pause here and I'll pause on the time. Let's see if we can sort this out.
No, I don't think so.
Jose Zupa, please continue.
Pas de problème. CMHC is Canada's national housing agency. We're guided by a bold aspiration that by 2030, everyone in Canada has a home that they can afford and that meets their needs. We're doing this in part by delivering the National Housing Strategy, a multi-billion-dollar plan grounded in a human rights-based approach to housing. And to achieve the goals of the strategy, our corporate aspiration, as well as support Canada's goal of reconciliation, we know that we must do more to address the diverse and pressing housing needs of Indigenous peoples. Canada has a severe shortage of housing supply, and it disproportionately affects Indigenous peoples. Based on 2016 census data, the rate of core housing need among Indigenous households is 18%, compared to the national average of 12.7%. The data reflects crowding, the need for major repairs, and unaffordable conditions. Indigenous people are also overrepresented among the 35,000 people who experience homelessness each night in Canada. They're also more than twice as likely to experience hidden homelessness, especially in the north, compared to their non-Indigenous counterparts. Indigenous housing needs are complex and they are urgent, and they're most dire across the territories where approximately 1/3 of the Indigenous population lives in unacceptable housing. There's much work to do with Indigenous partners to resolve this. We must continue to build and expand on what's being done by and with the federal government. So for example, First Nations, Inuit, and Métis Nation organizations, alongside Indigenous Services Canada and Crown Indigenous and Northern Affairs Canada, recently co-developed distinctions-based housing strategies for First Nations, Inuit, and Métis. And CMHC is very proud to be an active partner in this work. Still, the majority of Indigenous households live in urban, rural, and northern areas, and they also need access to safe, adequate, and affordable housing. That's why we're pleased to see that the mandate letter of the Minister of Housing and Diversity and Inclusion includes the commitment to engage with Indigenous partners and to co-develop an urban, rural, and northern Indigenous housing strategy. This strategy was one of the main recommendations of the previous HUMA Committee's report, and we at CMHC are ready and fully committed to support this work. In 2019, we also set up a new Indigenous and Northern Housing Solutions team to increase the uptake of our housing programs and help to navigate our funding options and application process. As a result, the number of Indigenous housing projects committed has increased exponentially and will continue to grow. Take, for example, the Rapid Housing Initiative, created to address the urgent need for housing in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic. The program received strong interest from Indigenous groups, and nearly 40% of all units created under the first round of this $2.5 billion program will benefit Indigenous households. I think one of the most important changes at CMHC has been a major shift in our approach to Indigenous housing. We're working with Indigenous partners to make existing programs more accessible, to build stronger relationships, and to support self-determination. This work is being led by our Indigenous and Northern Housing Solutions team. It's supported by our new Vice President of Indigenous Relations and will be guided by our Reconciliation Action Plan. First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people best understand the distinct housing needs of their people and communities. They are best placed to find solutions that work for them, and we are committed to helping them to succeed. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and the rest of the committee for studying this important issue. I'd be happy to take any questions you may have. Yes.
Thank you, Ms. Jose Zupa. We'll now proceed with the first round of questions, beginning with the Conservatives. Mr. Vidal, I believe that you're speaking first. You have 6 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I want to thank the witnesses for being here again. Minister Hagee, we're here on a Friday afternoon again. I think we did this not too long ago together. The study we're embarking on today as a committee obviously is in regards to the effects of housing shortages on Indigenous peoples. Over the past several months, the communities of Black Lake, Fond du Lac, and Pelican Narrows in my northern Saskatchewan riding have announced tuberculosis outbreaks. And Minister Hagee, you talked a little bit about that in your comments. We're talking about dozens of outbreaks and over 100 cases, and that's nearly double what it was a few years ago and much higher than it's been in over a decade. Rates of tuberculosis in Saskatchewan are continually above the national average, while in northern Saskatchewan, we make up 3.6% of the province population. But according to a study from 2021 that looked at the outbreaks of tuberculosis, it's responsible for half of the province's cases. The recently released departmental results report for Indigenous Services Canada for the years 2020 and 2021 admitted that the development of a tuberculosis reduction action plan for First Nations was not completed as planned. What's more concerning is that in the 2022-2023 departmental plan for ISC, I don't see any mention being made of any measures to prevent these outbreaks. I guess my questions are kind of threefold, and I'll throw them all out right away for Minister Hagee. Why is it that in a developed country like Canada in 2022, we continue to face tuberculosis outbreaks? What can I tell my constituents in northern Saskatchewan about when they can expect the government to release this action plan, and will it include targets? And finally, will this plan include some actual measures to deal with the overcrowded, unhealthy housing in these communities?
Well, thank you very much. And through the chair, I'm happy to say that I was in Saskatchewan, actually, I think it was last week, the week before last. Time takes on a new meaning in COVID. But just the last trip I took, I was actually in Saskatchewan, and I had a chance to meet with the FSIN and many other individual chiefs in the region. And we talked a lot about housing. As a matter of fact, in my opening remarks, I reflected on the leaders that have spoken to me about housing, and I was reflecting, and as I was saying those words, on the conversations I had specifically in Saskatchewan. As you know, Budget 2021, for example, commits $6 billion for infrastructure, including shovel-ready infrastructure projects and operations and maintenance costs, along with many other investments in First Nations health, including $5.5 billion, for example, to improve health outcomes through timely access and culturally appropriate medical care. You point out that housing is a critical ingredient to defeating infectious diseases like tuberculosis, and I would agree. I'd also say that we have to work more quickly on supporting, I would say, culturally appropriate medical care and access. Many of the First Nations leaders I spoke to on that trip talked to me quite eloquently, actually, about the exclusion they felt from appropriate medical care from the government of Saskatchewan, and spoke about the need for urgency in the co-developed health legislation and appropriate and culturally appropriate care that can be provided closer to home for people that are treating, in some cases, very difficult to treat illnesses like tuberculosis. So there's work on the housing front, on the social determinants of health, but also on the actual delivery of healthcare that, as you know, we deliver in partnership with provinces and territories.
Thank you for that. I want to turn my attention to Minister Miller for a minute. Minister, you and I have had a number of conversations about a project in northern Saskatchewan that we've been trying to have some success on. This is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. It involves the Metley Tribal Council and a company called One Sky Forest Products. And the idea behind this project was an opportunity to invest in a very successful project that was going to create all kinds of dividends for many First Nations in northern Saskatchewan and allow them to participate in the solutions to the housing crisis as we face in northern Saskatchewan. But as it turns out, this project didn't fit the normal kind of operating procedures of the federal bureaucracy. And to put it bluntly, the flexibility or the lack of flexibility became the barrier to getting this project off the ground. I'm just curious if you could respond to how do we justify to these northern communities when they want to be part of the solution and we can't get these projects across the line to allow them to participate in being part of that solution?
Yeah, thank you, MP Vidal, for the question. And I know I've changed roles, but I still have been following this with my team. Clearly, whether the facts in this case point to your conclusion that there is a lack of flexibility in funding in in the way we work, I don't want to necessarily get and talk to publicly out of respect from the communities in question, but I think the conclusion is not inaccurate insofar as what we've heard time and time again from communities is that lack of flexibility in our programs really hamper and confuse and delay, and particularly in housing. In this situation, when we're talking about tuberculosis on one hand or COVID on the other, actually can have real impacts on people's health and well-being. So while I won't question the facts and the premise, or at least discuss them or ventilate them publicly, I do think the conclusion is not inaccurate in many things we do. It's part of the reason why under my portfolio, under modern treaties, and the grant basis on which monies are allocated, it's really the federal government works, co-develops, and then gets the heck out of the way.
Mr. Vidal, you have about 10 seconds.
So really quickly then, would you agree, Minister, then, though, that we need to find opportunities for these communities to invest in projects where they can be part of the solution rather than relying strictly on government programs?
Yeah, and again, it depends on what issue we're really tackling. Whether it's issues of inequity, it's really underfunding by the federal government or other institutions that's created that. There's one approach, and then economic development, which was very much the case in question that you were championing, and that's another approach that we need to take. And it's multifaceted and goes across a number of departments. But yes, I do agree with you on the principles.
Thank you, Mr. Vidal. We'll now go to Mr. Weiler from the Liberal Party. Mr. Weiler, you have 6 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I'd also like to thank our ministers and officials today for joining for today's really important meeting on a study that's very much top of mind. I'd like to ask my first question to Ms. Rosé Zupa. It was a very special moment last week when I had the opportunity to announce, in partnership with the Squamish Nation, 80 units of new affordable housing that's going to be built within the next year for the benefit of the Squamish Nation. I was hoping you could talk a little bit more towards this project and other programs with the National Housing Strategy that are supporting the creation of new permanent affordable housing for Indigenous peoples.
Thank you very much for that question. I think you might be referring to a project done under the Rapid Housing Initiative. And the Rapid Housing Initiative specifically was introduced as a COVID response, a very, I would say, important and successful program, because of the incredible needs that were really intensified, especially during COVID, among those households that were already facing deep housing needs. And so under the Rapid Housing Initiative, there were 2 rounds of funding for a total of $2.5 billion. And what made this program a bit different from others is that it was 100% contribution funding for 100% of the capital dollars. And there was a real urgency behind it where units were meant to be provided and realized within a fairly short order, including through modular housing, for example, as well as other building techniques. So really for proponents to be able to apply, for us to get funding out the door as quickly as possible, but also acknowledging some flexibilities in Northern and Indigenous communities where we know that housing would take a bit more time to get out the door. So certainly we've seen great success, and about 40% of the units under the Rapid Housing Initiative have been committed to Indigenous projects.
No, that's. And as part of your opening testimony, you mentioned the creation of a new committee to help Indigenous peoples with accessing some of CMHC's funding. And I was hoping you could just speak a little bit more to how that committee operates, if it's more reaching out directly to First Nations, or is it something that you're waiting to be contacted to be able to assist in that regard?
Yeah, I was talking about an internal team within CMHC for Indigenous and Northern Housing Solutions. I have my colleague on here with me as well. Mr. Chair, am I able to bring him on to speak to that? He's directly delivering this and working with Indigenous partners.
Yes, you may, if Mr. Weiler agrees.
Absolutely.
Thank you. Go ahead, Ben.
Thank you. Merci beaucoup. Yes, Patricia was talking about some of the structure changes that we made back in 2019 in order to be honestly more flexible and more agile and responsive to Indigenous housing needs. And through that, we created a a dedicated team for Indigenous clients, roughly divided into two groups, one working directly with communities, First Nations across the country, for us to be able to better understand housing needs and actually respond to them. And then a second group that processes and prioritizes applications. And that way we are getting better results, quite frankly, through the National Housing Strategy focused on Indigenous households. Thank you.
Thank you. Next question I'd like to ask to Minister Miller. It came up oftentimes in our last study on barriers to economic development for Indigenous peoples, the challenges that lack of affordable housing creates. I know it consistently ranks as one of, if not the top priorities for First Nations in my riding, including self-governing First Nations. So I was hoping you could speak a little bit more to the Indigenous-led projects or partnerships related to housing and infrastructure that your department's involved in.
Yeah, and first I'll acknowledge that some of the confusion that can be created, whether it falls under Minister Haidu or Crown Indigenous Relations or under CMHC, it's difficult to navigate for MPs. It's difficult to navigate for Indigenous communities, and that is part of the stuff that we have a job in parsing out and figuring out, so that we're putting our best foot forward to communities that are in dire need. When it comes to self-governing nations, that is one of the distinctions that we funded in the last budget 2021, with over $500 million going to self-governing nations across the country, whether it's in Quebec or a good number of whom are in BC, including Sechelt, which benefited from close to $10 million of investments in affordable housing. It isn't enough, and I'm ready to readily acknowledge that. It's something that we'll have to relentlessly invest in to close the gap by 2030, and one of the challenges is quantifying it. The self-governing nations, as part of their advocacy, put forward a very well thought out analysis of where the gap is and what was needed to close it, and Budget 2021 allocated those amounts. So it's something, we don't go around patting ourselves on the back on it, because that gap is there, and it is expressed in real human need. But we're willing to move on it, whether it's through these investments, whether it's through rapid housing or others. And even I would note in BC, and that's where we need provincial governments on board. BC is leading the way, their own investments into housing, which is very, very significant.
Thank you,
Mr. Weiler. You have about 10 seconds.
I'll cede my time then. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Weiler. Madame Gill, vous avez 6 minutes.
Merci, Monsieur.
Thank you, Chair. First of all, I would like to thank the Ministers Miller and Hajdu and the officials, Ms. Zupa and Mr. Williams, for having given their testimony here today. I have a great deal of questions, being myself a member from a riding with 15% of its population being Aboriginal, so it's a very large territory where people live in places where there are no airplanes and no roads sometimes, and we quite simply have to get around by skidoo from one community to another. So there are glaring needs. It's a remote community, of course, but it is also isolated, and I would like to know, because I consider it important. We talk a lot about strategies and targets and where we're headed with the budget and what's been announced in the 2021 budget, but concretely out in the field, we don't necessarily see that, with a few exceptions that I could testify to in my own electoral district. However, we're talking about the Maslow pyramid. Housing is essential. We need to be protected, to be physically safe in order to be able to live, quite simply. And here, if we want to talk about the effects, I'd like to hear more from Ms. Hajdu, who talked about COVID being one of the effects, and the effects of it are exponential with regard to housing. I'd like to hear her more on other effects, because COVID is a temporary thing that's since 2019, but we've had a shortage for 60 years. So I would like to know more about the effects of the housing shortage on Indigenous nations.
Merci beaucoup, Madame.
Thank you very much, Ms. Gill.
Your questions and your comments around the effects that a lack of housing have really for people. And you're right, it's not just health effects, although those are well documented and well studied. Many people consider housing the foundation of wellness, whether we're talking about physical wellness, mental wellness, the ability to learn, to grow, to play. I also spoke to many Indigenous leaders over the last several months of the ongoing strain of crowded conditions. And, people told very, I would say, moving stories, housing that would incorporate 15 to 20 individuals in a community or in a household.
I'm sorry I have to interrupt you because I'd like to continue, but I can see that you're aware that these are problems that are huge. We're really talking about physical integrity of people. So we talked about economic development in our last session. And I would like to know whether you agree with me at the same time that the issue of housing is cross-cutting because we talk about economic development and other topics which have been put on the committee's agenda. But in fact, all of these subjects have, I would say, one of the main causes is the issue of housing. I wonder if you agree with that as well.
In principle, absolutely. I mean, without a safe place to call home, it's very hard for people to study. It's very hard for people to, raise families. It's very hard for people
Madame Hajdu,
to...
je pense que j'ai mal exprimé.
Excuse me, Ms. Hajdu. I'm sorry. I'm talking about the studies of the committee, not studies on an individual basis by the people. I'm talking about these studies here within the committee where everything is cross-cutting and the issue of housing cuts across all areas. That's what I meant.
I think we're agreeing.
Alors, j'aurai d'autres questions pour vous.
So I will have other questions for you, but time goes by quickly. You mentioned you wanted to invest $6 billion, of course, to deal with the housing shortage between now and 2030, you mentioned earlier. When we look at what's going on just in Quebec, I would say in Quebec, and more specifically on the issue of First Nations, I'm not talking about the Inuit, for example. We're talking about $3.9 billion to fill the gap within 5 years. And of course, you know about the demographic curve, which is exponential, which means that we won't even be able to fill the gap. And according to my calculations, it can be redone. It's basic arithmetic, but just in Quebec, with 225 units a year, it would take 44 years before we can fill a gap of the housing stock. And I'm not even talking about the demographic increase. Is that something that your department takes into consideration?
It is something that our department takes into consideration, and the $6 billion number that I referenced was the amount in budget 2021 alone. In fact, the department is working closely with Indigenous leaders and communities and researchers to understand the gap and to be able to plan out to 2030 what those investments will look like in order to close the gap.
Do you have a number already for that? Because $6 billion is not that much, even though at the same time it was part of the statement, but also what was distributed, what has been distributed out of that $6 billion. So what has been distributed, first of all, and secondly, you ought to have a number. If we make a basic calculation, we should see what we get for 2030.
Well, thank you, Madam Gill. And firstly, I'll just note that you reference that $6 billion is not a lot. I anticipate your support then for budget 2022 as we continue these investments in housing. I will turn to our officials to talk a little bit about how that $6 billion are being allocated and spent. Deputy Fox.
Oui, bonjour.
Yes, hello. Thank you very much, Chair, for the question. I would just like to note that the $6 billion, thus far out of that, we have invested $1 billion in projects in Quebec currently, which represents over 200 new units and more than 1,000 renovations, and also water service. So we're continuing to work with our Quebec partners, services to the residences. So we have a project in Quebec with new ways of investing in Quebec to gain access to capital. So this is a method that we're using in the department to turn the page and look at new financing models. And by means of this model, we have had some success in terms of new projects that have started. So I'll be pleased to share that information with you. Thank you, Ms. Gill. We will now move to Ms. Idlot.
6 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairperson. You have I have heard many questions, and I know that federal government has promised many thousands of money for many years now, and we expect to get the monies to build houses. I ask, what you asked previously, it impacts me, but the questions I need to ask you on behalf of Nunavut, which are also very important. We have a very bad shortage of housing, probably the worst in Canada. I have a question. I would like a clear response when I ask you. Firstly, I want to ask to Minister Miller. When the Prime Minister visited Nunavut in August, he made a promise to invest $306 million in Nunavut housing. Would you provide a breakdown of when this money will be delivered to Nunavut?
MP Lut, for that, I want to thank the translator for translating from Inuktitut into English. We made that commitment. It is something that we intend to commit. I can't speak as a cabinet minister as to the content and timing of budget. I fully expect our government to fulfill that. I know the work that we're doing in our department to continue to work with ITK, to land claims holders organizations, not only in working with their incredible work that they've done to put together numbers. A lot of the times advocacy organizations, I don't blame them, but we do throw numbers at each other. There's a lot of work that's been put into by ITK into crystallizing that into a tangible number that we can then turn with finance and work on and work through budgetary cycles. I know that sounds like technical speak, but it is very important work, and it's a testament to the level of advocacy that's been achieved. We have obviously through budgets 2016, 2018, and the most latest budget in 2021, altogether put close to over $1 billion in Inuit Nunangat. The current budget 2021 numbers on behalf of the advocacy organizations is not necessarily focused on housing. The previous amounts are, but clearly the lack that you've identified is there, and it's stuff that we have to keep working on with you and the work you're doing, MP Lut, but also ITK and the territorial government, plural, as well as the land claim holders.
What you mentioned earlier, to the commitment in 2018, the dollars committed, and you also mentioned 2019 and 2020 amounts that were committed. They built 83 houses. At the moment, Nunavut has a need for between 3,000 and 3,330 homes. Do you think this is adequate, the amount of money that you're committing? 83 houses were built with the commitments that were made.
On the timing, and we've seen challenges obviously with the short construction season. It's not an excuse, it's just a fact, and obviously it can't go fast enough. The logistical challenges through COVID are undeniable, and then as to the quantum, which as we've said, both Minister Haidu and I quite publicly, that it is not adequate, it is not sufficient, and we have to continue investing. I also want to apologize to you for the words I said in the House with respect to the average price of a house in Nunavut, I understated it. I believed it to be 400,000 or 500,000, and most recently I found out that it's closer to 600,000. There's been a huge spike over the last year, and I think that's been highlighted on the floor of the territorial parliament. But that is something we're also tackling with. So I would say also there's a third aspect to that, which is the spike in prices, which should be part of this study because it does impact the delivery and results on the ground.
With regards to housing in Nunavut, the HUMA report on Indigenous housing that this committee study is building from says quote, Crown Indigenous Relations and Northern Affairs Canada recognized that funding was not sufficient or consistent to meet the needs and that more work was needed to address housing needs. Work is a work that has been done by CERNAC to address the housing needs since your appearance at HUMA at the last Parliament. What has changed within the department? Thank you.
Thanks to the advocacy of Natan Obed and ITK, was once the amounts in Budget 2021 were approved, moved quickly through Treasury Board so that we could deploy those. So understanding the short construction season, understanding that those allocations needed to be made on a distinctions basis, getting those monies out as quickly as possible. Obviously, there's been logistical challenges. There will continue to be logistical challenges. But what we've heard and learned through that study, confirmed obviously through COVID and the Inuit's experience with overcrowding as the principal factor of driving the unacceptable tuberculosis rates in this country, is this is a human condition. It isn't necessarily one that has to do with bricks and mortar. It's about people and the ability to live in a not crowded situation, which, as I said in my introductory remarks, affect 52% of Inuit.
Thank you, Ms. Idlaut. We'll now proceed to the second round. We'll try to get as much as we can. We'll start with the Conservatives, who have 5 minutes. And I have a blank here. I'm not sure who is the Conservative who will speak, but you have 5 minutes.
I'll take that, Chair. Thank you. And good afternoon, everyone. Witnesses, we heard recently from the Lands Advisory Board, Robert Louis, in fact, that lands are central to First Nations traditions, identity, and prosperity. They are a crucial asset for advancing self-determination, economic development, and well-being. I think this goes to Minister Hajdu, but Minister Miller, you're welcome to interject if you want. Do you agree that First Nations should be governing and managing their own land interests?
Maybe I can, since you've addressed me, I will answer yes, that's the goal of this government, is self-determination and self-government. But in fact, as the Minister of Canada Relations, I would say Minister Miller has a lot to say about this subject.
My answer is yes.
Okay, perfect. Okay, so the Robert Louis also told us that the Lands Advisory Board, in partnership with the BC Land Title and Survey Authority, has been working with on a proposal for over a year now to establish an independent First Nation operated land registry system for First Nations with a land code under an earlier framework agreement. This proposal has been submitted to both departments, ISK and CRIR. Is there an update to where that submission is?
Officials could, just as an overarching comment, there needs to be more work done in this country as to how land is held, and it doesn't have to be the way I hold my property. I think that's one of the criticisms that has been fairly leveled on some of the self-governing work we've done. That work is largely incomplete. Some of the work that that's been done in and around land codes has been groundbreaking, and some communities are benefiting from, but doesn't fit for everyone. It is an impediment to moving forward on the self-governing status, and frankly, is one of the factors that are driving communities to choose to remain under the INAN, which is an unacceptable proposition, you'll agree. But there is work being done. It is painstaking work, and it's work that we have to keep pushing. But I wanted to offer those comments because it isn't simply the frame in which you're putting it, which is a very important one in terms of the speed and at which we're deploying programs that have already been accepted to and co-developed. But there's also a much larger discussion to be had as we work towards ensuring land is given back. Thank you. Daniel, if you have any additions to that.
Okay. I think that's it. Okay. I guess, unless I'm missing. No. Okay. Okay. I guess I'll just continue. I guess I can't hear anything. So I guess there's been 26 years since the framework agreement on the First Nation land management has been signed. 113 First Nations have enacted land codes and report that under no circumstance would they consider returning to the Indian Act. Could you just basically update to the committee, first of all, you have answered my question that you support moving to that type of model. Is there a plan, or where are you in that plan if you are planning it, to have a First Nations housing authority replace the current system that we have now? I know it's kind of a broad question.
Yeah, no, and I don't have a clear answer to that. I would say that those solutions aren't ones that we impose. I think it's some of the reflection. While there is well over 100 communities that would choose to organize themselves that way, it isn't perfect for everyone. And the ones that have availed themselves of it in a way that serves their people. That is pretty much all I would have to offer on that. On an independent housing authority, perhaps Minister Haidu or some of the officials could chime in.
Maybe I can just give an overarching endorsement of Minister Miller's, top line, which is it's not going to look the same, all across the country. That this has to be Indigenous led and Indigenous supported, and each region, each community has a different perception of how that work will unfold. So, Deputy Minister Fox, though, you've been involved in these conversations. Perhaps you can add a few comments.
So maybe I would make two comments on the Indigenous housing institution. This is definitely something that we're looking into. It's been proposed by the National Housing Council as an idea to address remote, urban, and northern housing challenges. And so as we look at transferring service, as we look at self-determination, I would say that that's definitely a model that we're looking on. And then when it comes to, the proposal with respect to the Indigenous First Nations Land Registry and land codes, I think it is a really important part of self-determination and land codes. And we see that as being sort of stepping away from being under the Indian Act, which is a really important self-determination action. And then we obviously work very closely with Indigenous communities when it comes to additions to reserve. And sometimes those are straightforward. Sometimes they're extremely complex, as you can imagine, with provincial, territorial, other First Nations. But we look to see how we can support our Indigenous partners as they work through those issues. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Schmale. We'll now go to Mr. Pawlowski. Mr. Pawlowski, you have 5 minutes.
Thank you, and thank you for the ministers being here. My question is for Patty. She knows, but for the sake of the other people in the committee who don't know, she's sitting right now in Fort William First Nations, which is my riding. And as she knows, a very big issue, in fact, the one most important issue that Chief Collins of Fort William First Nations came to me with was the issue of getting federal funding for a chronic care home in Fort William First Nations. And certainly COVID has illustrated, I think, for all Canadians, the importance of chronic care homes and the fact that the elderly should be able to hopefully spend the last years of their life in good surroundings, and that isn't always the case in Canada. Now, I know, and she probably knows, that it's been a bit of a battle trying to find funding for that. Hopefully, we found a source of funding in the Green and Inclusive Fund from infrastructure. But the problem, I think, is fairly ubiquitous in First Nations communities, probably also among the Inuit. Is there funding specifically, either from you, and I guess CMHC may want to comment on this, funding for chronic care homes in Indigenous communities? Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, MP Pulaski. And actually, technically, I'm today not on the Fort William First Nation. I'm in my constituency office in my riding, but it's still within the territory of Fort William First Nation. And you're right, I've spoken with Chief Collins as well about this project and the idea that Indigenous people are often facing care needs far, far away from home or in non-culturally appropriate settings. And that's certainly something I think we can all relate to as members of Parliament for various regions across this country. My office is working with Minister LeBlanc's office on this application to the Green and Renewable and Green Infrastructure Fund. The question of infrastructure priorities is one that is different across the country. And of course, each community has been or has completed their infrastructure planning process. And some of those do contain plans or desires to create all kinds of different care facilities. But maybe I can turn to Chris to talk a little bit about what she's seeing in that infrastructure planning that's happening across the country.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that $6 billion investment is really meant to be for schools, for health infrastructure, for other types of facilities. And in some cases, we're seeing, creative approaches to multi-purpose buildings. So you may have your Indigenous early learning and childcare center in the same area as you would have a long-term care home. So between the programs at Indigenous Services Canada, as well as the programs at CMHC and infrastructure, we really try to look at what is that community infrastructure plan, what does that asset management plan look like, and then how can we best support through the various Government of Canada programs. Thank you.
In follow-up, and maybe I can ask someone from the department about this, I think, and even for my office, when we kind of look at how to assist Indigenous communities with this kind of problem, we don't really know where to start in terms of we go to Indigenous Services, and then we go to CMHC, and then we go to the Ministry of Health. Is there anyone, like one place, one person that communities can go to say this is the issue, which ministry should I start off with in trying to address this problem?
I'm happy to take that. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thanks for the question. I think what I would say is that our regional executives across the country, we do have a footprint across the country at Indigenous Services Canada, and they are really meant to be that single window where they work with communities on what their needs are. And sometimes, as you note, it can be something that Indigenous Services Canada provides, and at times it's broader than that. And I think that it can be, and we can appreciate this, overwhelming to navigate all of the government programs. So we really are trying to take a community-centered approach to see what the needs are, what the priorities of the community are, and then how can we then turn around and work with our colleagues in the federal system to try to address some of those needs. And that's the approach that we try to take. And we work very closely with CMHC and Infrastructure Canada in that regard.
Mr. Pawlowski, you have about 10 seconds.
Ms. Ruiz-Zupu, you mentioned hidden homelessness. You didn't explain it. What is this?
Yes, thank you for that question, Mr. Chair. Hidden homelessness is a case where people are homeless but are not going to shelters, for example. They might be not having their own stable housing, but are couch serving with family members or friends, or going from home to home. So we don't necessarily have a good recording of it. I must say that the further experience and expertise when it comes to homelessness, we do a lot of that work with our colleagues in Infrastructure Canada. But I hope that helps answer your question in brief.
Thank you, Mr. Pawlowski. Nous allons maintenant aller à Madame.
And now we will turn to Ms. Gill. Ms. Gill, you have 2.5 minutes. Thank you, Chair. I have another question for Minister Hajdu, but Mr. Miller may also answer. We talked about demographics earlier, and I would like to know whether the forecasts for housing take into account demographics. And I talked to First Nations, but I'd also like to talk about the Inuit. But if you recall, there was a Senate committee a few years ago which said that gradually, as the need increases for housing in Nunavut, financing was decreasing. and there was a kind of a line, there was a certain demarcation line between 2021 and 22. I'd like to know if that's been corrected. Thank you.
Short answer, Madam Gill, yes, it does project. The planning does take into account growth projections.
Ça, c'est la...
That's the answer to my first question, but there were two at the same time. The second one had to do with Nunavut. As I said, the financing curve is downward, and at the same time, that of demand is increasing. And we were in 2017 at the time. Your government was in power then, and I'd like to know whether there's an updated chart of the proportion of the financing, for example, as compared to the housing needs, and it could be for all the communities. It would be interesting to be able to have access to those data.
We can certainly arrange to provide the data to the committee.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much. I would have a last question if I have time, Chair. We also talked about isolation and remoteness. Is this also a factor taking into account? We talked about economic development and the fact that, of course, building a house in Nunavut or on an island or 2,000 kilometers away with the costs of labor and materials are not the same. So, of course, 300,000 in one region is not the same thing somewhere else. Is that also being taken into account in the subsidies and all the work that you do? Thank you.
Yes, Madam Gill, isolation, the cost of the increased cost of delivery and materials in the north, and in fact, some delays. Budget 21, an additional $134 million related to the cost of.
Perhaps I can make a clarification. You said in the north, but in my areas in Quebec, if it's isolated, even if the same conditions as the north, they don't always refer to them as the north. Thank you. Does it apply to
northern and remote communities?
Merci beaucoup, Madame Gill.
Thank you very much, Ms. Gill.
Last speaker in this first panel, Ms. Sidlaut. Ms. Sidlaut, you have 2.5 minutes.
Thank you. I'd like to ask you about elder care and the housing needs that Indigenous seniors and elders have. I've spoken many times about the complete absence of long-term care spaces and facilities, and the fact that elders in Nunavut have to leave their communities and support networks to receive care in other cities. One significant barrier for Inuit seniors to actually receive medical care is the fact they will lose their home or they won't have a home that they can return to if they leave their home. What is your department doing to provide assurances to seniors and elders that they'll be able to receive care without losing their homes?
First off, is that me or Patty?
You can go ahead.
Yeah, and maybe you can complete my thoughts, Patty. First of all, it's unacceptable that we'd have to have elders flown outside their communities, very disoriented. In Ottawa is a prime example of that, and many, including the Premier's grandfather is here. So people should be able to, at various stages of their elder years, be in their homes, and that's clear. The flexibility of the funding that we've provided to the north is a partial answer to that. But there needs to be a more comprehensive approach as to how people can age in their communities, especially since they're the carriers of the language and they have a lot to teach their kids and they're surrounded by their own. So we're not getting it right. We've taken a few steps to start to get it right, but clearly I think there are a number of factors that are aligned right now that will allow us to take a little more profound step on how care is given and provided closer to where people live. As to the keeping their houses, I wouldn't have an answer to that, but perhaps Minister Haidu would like to
Well, thank you very much. I think there's a couple parts to this, and one would be the investment in renovations, and they need to be flexible enough to be considering accessibility, something that an unrelated but related minister speaks about all the time, Minister Qualtrough. We should be making things accessible from the get-go because, of course, we know that that will serve us well in terms of the needs of a population. But I think the other piece is really a model of care that is co-developed and that has a reflection of the needs from a cultural perspective of communities to stay intact and to provide care to the degree that's possible at home in community. And I agree with Minister Miller. We are a long ways away from where we need to be in this regard. And it is extremely difficult for families that are separated because of a lack of care in their home community, whether on a First Nations or in another remote community like the ones that you are speaking about, MP Luke.
Thank you, Ms. Idlout. That brings our panel to a conclusion. I'd like to thank, on behalf of the committee members, Ministers Haidu and Minister Miller, and also from the CMHC, Miss, my piece of paper here, I beg your pardon, Miss Rosette Zupa, excuse me, and Mr. Williams for associate. So thank you very much for coming today and answering our questions. And this brings the panel to a conclusion. And we'll miss Madam Clerk, if our guests for the second panel are ready, we can proceed, well, immediately.
We'll do a brief sound check first, sir.
Very good. Thank you.
Chief Woodhouse, may I? Sir.
All right. Thank you very much. Thank you to our panelists who are joining us today. We have Regional Chief Cindy Woodhouse from the Assembly of First Nations, Chief Lance Aymon from l'Assemblée des Premières Nations
from the Assembly of First Nations of Quebec and Labrador, accompanied by Mr. Latouche.
Tan Obed, President of the Inuit Tapiriit Kanatami, with us today. Same procedure as usual, panelists and committee members. So we'll start off with a 5-minute presentation from Regional Chief Cindy Woodhouse. Chief, you have the floor for 5 minutes. So did we lose the chief? Chief Woodhouse, are you there?
Good afternoon. Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you now. You have 5 minutes. Please go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you. Good afternoon. My name is, welcome to each and every one of you, first and foremost. I'm coming to you live from the Treaty 1 territory here in Winnipeg, Manitoba. I'm from a small First Nation community where I was raised with my parents and my 4 brothers. It's called Penemutang. It's a small community in central Manitoba. And I'm coming to you from the Assembly of First Nations. I'm responsible for the housing portfolio. Mr. Chairman and members of the committee, miigwech for inviting me to the Assembly of this. Miigwech for inviting the Assembly of First Nations to address the focus of your current study, the effects of the housing shortage on Indigenous peoples across Canada. First Nations have been living with the impacts of a housing shortage for generations. First Nations housing suffers from decades of federal underfunding and neglect, which leads to a host of negative outcomes in health, education, and economic progress. There are regular news media reports of First Nations trying to manage COVID-19 outbreaks amid overcrowded houses with no space for isolation. I suspect that you would want to focus, as the federal government and the Assembly of First Nations have been doing jointly over the last few years, on how to fix the problem. First Nations are moving towards the control of our own housing as part of the solution to the housing crises. Now the Minister of Finance must do her part, which is to fulfill Canada's treaty fiduciary and other obligations by making the needed guaranteed investment of $44 billion to meet the current First Nation housing needs, plus an additional $16 billion to accommodate population growth projected to 2040 for a total of $60 billion. First Nations reasonably expect the full amount of that investment now, as the federal government has, since 2016, repeatedly told First Nations that it is committed to fully addressing the housing shortage. The Assembly of First Nations submitted to you the 2021 research report we commissioned that provides the breakdown of estimated costs to address overcrowding, replacements of units, repairs, renovations, servicing of lots, and other costs. With the data now in hands on the real costs of the unmet First Nations housing needs, there is no excuse for a delay. Anything short of full funding will not result in First Nations raising the standard of our housing to a level comparable to that of mainstream Canadians. The control by First Nations of our own housing is a key pillar in the National First Nations Housing and Related Infrastructure Strategy, a copy of which the AFN office made available to you, upon which I can expand during the question and answer period. The solution has several additional requirements of the federal government. To conclude as soon as possible agreements with those First Nations that are willing to assume care, control, and management of their housing, a process that has already started. To co-develop and design with the Assembly of First Nations sufficiently funded and the First Nation exclusive federal housing programs for First Nations that choose not to assume control of their housing in the short or medium term. And an additional federal investment of $21.37 billion is needed in community infrastructure, without which additional housing is not possible in many cases. The Assembly of First Nations has also requested an additional $2.6 billion of federal investments over the next 5 years for programs and services aimed at preventing and eliminating homelessness. The Assembly of First Nations is developing a national action plan on First Nations homelessness that is based on First Nations administering our own homelessness programs. The Assembly of First Nations is also working with Infrastructure Canada to provide recommendations based on research and engagement of First Nations on priorities for the First Nations distinction-based funding stream of the federal Reaching Home program. The current budgets of the federal government homelessness program for the First Nations are insufficient compared to the immense needs. They must be adequately funded to be successful. In closing, Canada's obligation under the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples includes full financial support for First Nations to manage and control our own housing. I just want to thank you for your time today, Miigwech, and I'm ready to take questions that you may have.
Thank you very much, Chief Woodhouse. We'll have our second speaker now, Chief Lance Aymon. Chief, you have 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the members of the committee for the invitation. My name is Lance Aymon. I'm the chief of the Algonquin community of Kibawek. I am the portfolio holder for the Assembly of First Nations of Quebec and Labrador, and I also sit as the representative for Quebec on the AFN Chiefs Committee on Housing and Infrastructure. I'm coming to you from the unceded Algonquin territory of my community, which is located about 400 kilometers north of Ottawa. The effects of housing shortage on First Nation peoples are numerous. The reason is quite simple. Housing has ramifications in all spheres of our society: health, education, and not to mention the efficient functioning of the economy. Links can be made with other aspects of society, such as employment and community development. I don't need to tell you that housing is an important determinant of health. I would even go further that it is an important factor in the academic success of our children. It's very difficult for our children to study and do homework when they live in overcrowded conditions with multiple generations of their families living in the same house, vying for space, time, and the opportunity. It also contributes to economic activity in many of our communities. It provides much needed employment. In short, affordable and adequate housing does more than reduce poverty and improve public health. It is a basic condition for personal and social development. The state of housing situation in First Nations in Quebec is a file that has been well documented for over 20 years. As we started to gather, our statistics starting in 2000, we have reliable data that indicates that in Quebec, we need 10,000 housing units should be added to make up for the accumulated backlog. In particular, overcrowding, population growth, migration of members who potentially wish to live in the community, and the replacement of condemned housing. Our figures also indicate that 8,000 housing units require renovations or repairs, and that 9,500 residential lots must be serviced to build the new housing units. As Regional Chief Woodhouse indicated, the number nationally is staggering. For Quebec region, the investment needed is $3.9 billion. It should be noted that we build on average around 225 housing units per year within our communities with regular funding levels. Rather, between 1,000 and 2,000 units per year should be built to eliminate the accumulated backlog, and we're projecting this over a period of 5 to 10 years. This portrait confirms that housing shortage that is experienced in many of our communities. So I come back to the fundamental role that housing plays in society. This role is not currently assumed due to the huge magnitude of the needs facing our communities. There is also an overrepresentation of First Nation members in the inevitable statistics. I am thinking, for example, of the overrepresentation of our people in the legal system, overrepresentation of homelessness, and in particular in urban areas, of respiratory and other health-related illnesses and problems. All of this certainly is not unrelated, at least in part, to the gloomy portrait of housing that I have drawn for you. It is therefore not surprising that in the report of the Public Inquiry Commission on Relations between Indigenous People and Certain Public Services in 2019, Commissioner Vien sets out a striking observation. I will quote what Commissioner Vien wrote in his report. From the outset of the Commission's work, the major housing crisis affecting Aboriginal people has indeed emerged as the epicenter of many problems experienced by First Nations and Inuit. There is a need not only for new investment, we need to tackle the root cause. It has been recognized that Aboriginal communities face significant housing issues. We do not see in the short term a radical change in the housing situation of our communities. We face great challenges, and here are a couple of examples. Our population is young. It is increasing rapidly. In fact, 4 times faster than that of the province over a 10-year period, despite the fact the housing shortage is slowing down growth in many of our communities. Another revealing figure is the median age of our members in Quebec, which is 28, compared to 43 for the non-Indigenous population. In some communities, it barely exceeds 20 years, the median age. The increase in our housing needs is supported by the growing demographics. The increase in construction costs is felt by everyone, but that particularly affects us because the capital budgets of our communities are not adjusted accordingly. Housing is a sector that is chronically underfunded. There'd be so much more I'd like to tell you, but I'll stop here. It will be my pleasure to answer your questions, to tell you more about the particular challenges in remote regions, about our vision of the future, and more particularly in relation to a way out of the crisis. Thank you for taking the time to listen to me. Miigwech.
Thank you very much, Chief Haymond. I'll now turn to President Obed. President Obed, you have 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and good afternoon to all the members of the committee. ITK is the national representational organization for Inuit in Canada, the majority of whom live in Inuit Nunangat, the Inuit homeland, encompassing 51 communities across the Inuvialuit settlement region in the Northwest Territories, the entirety of Nunavik in northern Quebec, and Nunatsiavut in northern Labrador. There are 3 things I hope you'll take from my brief presentation. First, the Inuit Nunangat housing crisis is decades long and has persisted to the detriment of Inuit health, educational attainment, and economic development. Decades worth of data show that Inuit experience worse housing outcomes and attendant social and economic challenges than non-Indigenous Canadians. This crisis has existed since the Government of Canada coerced Inuit into communities in many cases after World War II, and has not abated since the advent of Inuit living in fixed communities in the way in which the Government of Canada had hoped that Inuit would. Second, we need to continue the work of overturning colonial housing policies that systemically marginalize Inuit. Inuit estimate that the cost of ending the Nunangat housing crisis is almost 10 times more than what the federal government is currently providing to Inuit. Third, we need legislative and policy changes that respect Inuit rights, including the implementation of comprehensive land claim and self-governing agreements, and the enforcement of our human right to housing. Inuit and the Government of Canada jointly recognize that the lack of appropriate and affordable housing is a national crisis. This is the first statement contained in the Inuit Nunangat Housing Strategy, which was jointly developed through the Inuit Crown Partnership Committee and released in 2019. In the early 1990s, the first Aboriginal people survey found that 40% of Inuit households were in core housing need. In 2016, little had changed. That year, 40% of Inuit were in core housing need compared to about 11% of non-Indigenous Canadians. We need legislative and policy changes that respect Inuit rights, including the implementation of our land claim agreements, as I've said earlier. Federal housing policy has changed significantly since 2019 with the passage of the National Housing Strategy Act that recognizes the right to housing as a fundamental human right affirmed in international law, including by the Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights ratified by Canada. While Inuit applaud this change, we were disappointed by the absence of recognition and commitment to enforce implementation of our human right to housing. Our right to housing must be recognized in Canadian law and given expression through meaningful distinctions-based policies and enforcement mechanisms that advance our right to self-determination. We must reinvest also in Inuit Nunangat housing delivery. Until quite recently, the federal government's inadequate response to the perennial housing shortage in Inuit Nunangat was to build on its relationship with provinces and territories. That relationship changed in 2016 when the Government of Canada began directing distinctions-based housing investments towards Inuit through federal budgets. This was an important move, but $40 million per year over 10 years is not enough. Inuit estimate that it will cost almost 10 times more than this to meet the Government of Canada's housing commitment. In our view, the Minister of Housing and Diversity and Inclusion will need to make substantial renewed investments in Inuit housing in order to meet his government's commitment to close the Inuit Nunangat housing gap by 2030. Without these legislative and fiscal tools, the Inuit housing and public health crisis will surely endure. We have heard of a shared intent, a level of ambition by the Government of Canada to end infrastructure deficits and end housing deficits within Indigenous communities by specific targeted dates. We now call on the Government of Canada to put the framework in place and get the money flowing so as to make good on the shared ambition that we all have to end the Inuit housing crisis.
Thank you, President Obed. I will now proceed with the first round of questions, beginning with the Conservatives. I have Mr. Schmale down for 6 minutes.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you, witnesses. Thank you for your testimony. Might start with Chief Haymond. In your testimony, you had laid out some pretty challenging conditions and the situation as whole. You also said we need to get to the root cause. Could you expand on a little bit of that? What are the root causes that we have to address in order to help fix some of the challenges you had laid out in your testimony?
So what I meant by root cause really is ensuring that every family that requires has adequate and suitable housing that meets their needs. It's the foundational piece that's required. It's pretty hard to address the social ills, the addiction issues, the overcrowding, and all of the other challenges that exist when families and individuals don't have a place to call home. So the root cause of a lot of the challenges that we see with our people, the migration to urban centers, the challenges that are brought on as people move out of the communities, again, is really representative of the fact that there's not adequate housing in our communities. And so they end up migrating out to urban areas and run into a whole host of new challenges. So our principal philosophy is that providing adequate and suitable housing will be one of those main issues where families and individuals don't need to worry. And then we can start tackling the other issues like job creation, better health services, educational outcomes for our children. Again, so when I talk about root cause, a lot of the challenges that we face as First Nation people stem from the fact that we don't have adequate housing.
Okay, I'm very sorry to hear that. Maybe is some of the problem with the CMHC and the way they do their operations? I think we're hearing it from a number of people, but are you noticing issues with even barriers or blocks to people accessing a mortgage, proper insurance, even loans for renovations? Are you seeing the CMHC as a potential organization that might need a bit of a redesign?
The simple answer, quite frankly, is yes. Because again, they've managed on-reserve housing programs for a number of years. they've remained static and have not changed while our realities in our world have changed. So Quebec's vision is not only to have additional investment, we are also looking at building our capacities within our communities and looking at new and innovative ways to meet our housing needs. So I don't necessarily view CMHC or Indigenous services as not doing what they need to. In fact, in Quebec, we have the only tripartite committee that exists across this country, where we sit down with CMHC and Indigenous services and try and find solutions that work for the First Nations in Quebec. So I view CMHC and ISK as partners in finding ways moving forward.
Okay, thank you, Chief Heyman. I want to quickly, I have more questions for you, but I think I'm running out of time very quickly. Maybe go to Chief Woodhouse if I could. Chief Woodhouse, you talked about negotiations on First Nations who want control of their own housing. Can you give us an update on that?
Thank you for the question. Yeah, there's many First Nations who, have created their own control of their housing, their own, there's many different models out there, and I encourage you to I'll get back to you with some of those some of the different examples of many First Nations communities who want control and who continue to face many barriers when it comes to, different parts of, lack of funding and many other issues. Thank you.
All right, maybe I could pick up on that as well. When you said some barriers, I mentioned CMHC earlier and their even their lack of movement on a changing situation on the ground. Maybe I'll get you to comment on that, and then I'll go to my next question.
I think I'll say this from CMHC, and I'm hearing a little bit of background. When it comes to CMHC, I think them working more closely with First Nations would be helpful. We hear time and time again from many First Nations communities that, they're trying to work through and even small details of things, and then they feel like they're going to be left out of the housing process or the allocation of housing when some things can be fixed, I'll say, and one of them could be, maybe sometimes people, they change reporting or even communications from CMHC towards our First Nations community is very problematic. And sometimes I feel like, trying to get, I'll say for Manitoba First Nations, requesting that from CMHC to meet with them is very problematic sometimes. And it's very frustrating when our First Nations have diverse issues, but many of them are common issues on certain things when it comes to like rapid housing. It was some people felt like they were left out of rapid housing when they should have been, included, or because they were isolated that they were left out of that. That's just one example. So I'll leave that there, but I think that there's very much room for improvement, very much room to improve the communication between CMHC and First Nations communities.
Thank you, Mr. Schmale. We'll now go to Mr. Baptiste. Monsieur Baptiste, you have...
I'd really like to start off by congratulating and acknowledge the leadership of Regional Chief Woodhouse in getting to the agreement in principle, the historic agreement in principle on child and family services and Jordan's principles. I know that she worked hard on that, and I just want to congratulate her efforts on that before I get to the questions. Also, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm really happy to hear that there is an AFN Chiefs Committee on Housing. I know that 6 minutes often isn't enough time to get your interventions in place, but we'd be more than happy as a committee if you have innovative approaches to housing, that you please share that. For the next 4 meetings, we will be doing this study, and so you'd have a little bit of time, I'd say a month, to prepare a document that can help us make better recommendations for on reserve. My first question is around many of the challenges on the reserve that I'm hearing from many of my constituents, such as Chief Leroy Denny, talk about reserves being in place for sometimes 100 years, sometimes more than 80 years, where Indigenous communities were centralized in areas by government programs, and now many years later, they're running out of land. And it's hard to find land on reserve to build houses, even if they have the money. And so I'm wondering, Chiefs, do you believe that a part of the solution is additions to reserve? And how can we speed up the process of additions to reserve to reflect the growing population increases of First Nations? We'd start with you.
So go ahead, Chief Heyman. You can get the ball rolling.
Okay. Thank you very much for the question. Again, I think it's really dependent upon the individual communities and the region. Most certainly, land or access to land, becomes a problem. As you mentioned, when reserves were first created, many of them were only, 10, 15, 20 hectares in size. But with demographic growth, legal decisions like C31, S3 have added significant numbers of new people to our communities, thus, a requirement for additional lands. Additions to reserve is one way of acquiring those lands. Quite complex, difficult, challenging. I speak from experience. It took us 10 years to double in size from 20 hectares to 40 hectares. So I speak from experience that additions to reserve may not be the only solution. I believe Minister Miller has spoken openly about giving land back to First Nations. And so we're really interested and curious as to what that could look like. And again, as an Algonquin leader and community whose nation has unceded territory, we believe that, there may be other avenues to explore and not solely rest on the process of additions to reserve, which, as I mentioned, takes too long, too complex. And again, it can be rather difficult when the province or the municipalities that we're adjacent to decide that they don't want to give up the land. Thank you.
So I'm hearing you loud and clear that we need to speed up that process, and I agree with you. Before the treaties and before settlers arrived, Indigenous people were able to access their resources, timber, many things like this, to create their own homes, create their own furnitures. Do you, and I'll talk to Cindy, you can answer this, or Chief Heyman, do you believe that housing is an Aboriginal right under Section 35 of the Constitution?
Do you want to go ahead, Chief Woodhouse?
Absolutely. I feel like it's a right. It's also, it creates economic stability in many of our First Nations, but more importantly, my grandfather, his name was Chief Richard Woodhouse. He signed Treaty 2 in 1871, and we were always told that we would be the right to housing, the right to education and all these other things. Absolutely, it's a right. It's a human right, more importantly, and every Canadian deserves a home, but we've given up a lot in this country, and many of our people are living in third world conditions, and that's unacceptable. Thank you.
Okay. I guess the last question I will ask, housing on reserve is important for the homes for people, but it's also important for job creation, for carpenters, for electricians, for plumbers. Can you talk a little bit about what housing means to First Nations communities on reserve?
Yeah, absolutely. So I know one community that had, within their own, they created their own housing committee, their own housing development corporation within their First Nation community. And that was the spinoff on that was enormous to the families, to the community that was there, and to making sure that, housing on reserve, that they knew how to repair their own homes. They knew how to keep that economy going, and that it ensured that their children and people thereafter, and that the young people were becoming plumbers, becoming electricians, and creating economic stability for themselves and for their community. It meant so much to so many people, and I think that's so important to try and creating an economy within the First Nations communities instead of always contracting it outward.
So I'm hearing loud and clear that housing is part of the economy as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Baptiste. Nous allons maintenant passer à Madame.
And now we will move on to Ms. Gill. Ms. Gill, you have 6 minutes. Thank you, Chair. I would like to thank all of the witnesses, Chief Uras, Chief Amond, and of course, Mr. Obed. I really appreciated your testimony, and there are 2 words that stood out to me that are very important. Chief Amond, you mentioned the word epicenter. Mr. Obed, you mentioned the word crisis. And to me, I think these are 2 terms that we ought to keep in mind throughout the study and also for our recommendations. When we talk about the epicenter of all the problems that First Nations can experience, to my mind, it's absolutely essential for us to keep that in mind. And also, I spoke more about Quebec, but it concerns Canada as a whole, of course, all the First Nations, Indigenous and Métis. And I participated in the First Nations Economic Circle of Quebec last fall in November. So it was not so long ago. It's an anecdote, but to show you how important it is within Quebec for the First Nations. I wanted to, well, there were a number of activities and sessions that were planned, and one of them was on housing, and all the chiefs told us it makes no sense to participate in the one of the FNQL. I know Mr. Chief Amon was there, because to them it was the priority. So Chief Amon spoke about some priorities. I would have liked to hear you about several things, solutions that can be made. You talked about financing, underfinancing. When you talked about strategies on housing affecting Quebec, I don't know if there's something there that you could add as a solution. Thank you.
Absolutely, and thank you for the question. So while we hear and we speak about a national housing strategy, we're, agreeable to that happening, as long as there's room for regions like Quebec, to take charge and take the lead in developing the housing solutions for our communities. So with the data that we've been collecting since 2020, we just don't simply sit on it. We have developed in concert with our chiefs and our housing administrators in our respective communities a strategy that is built on 3 pillars. And it really touches a little bit on what Mr. Baptiste spoke about as well. Housing can be an economic development driver. We're looking at it more so in the sense that as part of our Quebec strategy adopted by the Chiefs in Assembly, we need to develop capacities at all levels. So better housing administrators, chief and councils who understand the cost of housing, carpenters, plumbers, all of those opportunities that exist. We also have a second pillar, which is looking at how do we get more funds to address the needs, but at the same time look at more financing options. Because when we talk about CMHC and Indigenous services, we're primarily talking about social housing. We're not really talking about home ownership, and there's opportunity to explore that further with our communities as well. And the final pillar of our strategy is we need more autonomy. And that autonomy means that being able to make decisions that are in the best interests of the First Nations in Quebec. We know the situation, we know our communities well, and at the end of the day, Indigenous services, CMHC, the Assembly of First Nations can profess to finding solutions, but at the end of the day, to make them applicable and implementable, they have to be designed and within the strategy that's already been adopted by the chiefs in Quebec. And as we said, the numbers and the needs are staggering. So we have a plan.
Merci, Chef Amon.
Thank you, Chief Amon. I have another question for you concerning one aspect we haven't discussed yet, which the study is beginning, but as of today, well, with regard to the effects that it has on the members of First Nations who have to leave their community on account of a lack of housing. Of course, we talked about homelessness, but I think in a more holistic viewpoint, everything that can represent for members of the communities and for the communities too when those people have to leave them. Thank you. Miigwech.
Yes, again, the fact that we can't meet the on-reserve housing needs leads to a host of issues, overcrowding, social issues related to addictions and other issues. And so, yes, we see our people gravitating towards an urban environment. And it's unfortunate because in some instances, they lose contact with our communities, lose contact with the programs and services that are only available on reserve. And, when they leave, they're looking for a better place and a better outcome. But that's not always happening. So again, there's ample opportunity to help us build the housing we need on reserve. And at the same time, a lot of these folks who transition to urban areas, they end up being, key personnel who have a lot of times the skill sets that, could benefit the community down the road. And we lose access, to this capacity as well. So it's a double-edged sword. We lose good people, and good people, lose ties and access to programs and services available only to a non-reserve member. Thank you.
Merci, Madame Gill.
Thank you, Ms. Gill.
You have 6 minutes.
Thank you. I'd like to thank all the speakers that came here. Very interesting presentation. But I wish to speak and ask Natan Obed. I'm happy to see another Inuk here. And I'm happy to hear about Inuit issues. I'll ask you, Natan. Since in April 2019, you identified that funding was announced in federal budgets, but that has been slow to reach Inuit, which results in housing delivery delays. Since that statement, the COVID-19 pandemic occurred and slowed progress on housing development significantly. What specific recommendations do you have to change colonial policies you mentioned in your great presentation? Thank you.
The challenges that we have had, not only with housing, but other infrastructure dollars, is that if there is an announcement in a federal budget or an announcement by the government for a specific initiative, there's the approvals in Treasury Board, the approvals of the terms and conditions, the agreements that then are made between Inuit land claim organizations or territorial or provincial governments and the federal government all delay the ability to start on those housing projects or those infrastructure projects. And we're not talking about a month or two, we're talking about missing a window by a few weeks leads to a year of delay. So when we talk about the concerns around flowing funds for infrastructure, especially for housing, the needs of the sea lift season and the ability to procure the goods for that sea lift season are make or break for whether or not we're able to have our shovel-ready projects, as the government loves to use that term, actually go to fruition in the timelines that the government would like to see them. As I've said on a number of different areas, we have shared ambition. So Inuit want something that the government wants. We try our best to figure out how to undertake the work in the way that the government demands, but often the government doesn't necessarily care about the limitations that Inuit and Inuit Nunagat have when it comes to deadlines and when it comes to terms and conditions and programs. So we would love to see more distinctions-based focus. And also from an Inuit perspective, we need to have flexibility within the way in which funds are delivered that allow for the challenges that we face with remoteness, and also with the costs. Our costs are much higher than in other places. As insofar as reform for legislative changes, we have the federal housing legislation that was passed only a few years ago that has significant gaps in relation to distinctions-based Indigenous perspectives. We need to revisit that particular act and ensure that there is a declared housing policy under Part 4 of the act that could include explicit commitment to linking the right to housing for Indigenous peoples as a judiciable right under the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples.
Thank you for your reply. Second question. Long before COVID-19 impacted our communities and the world, tuberculosis has been a serious problem across the territory. Overcrowding and lack of clean water have been significant factors in the spread of tuberculosis. Is the government doing enough today to make sure that our communities can be healthy and safe in our own homes? Thank you.
In relation to tuberculosis, the very first time that the federal government ever publicly promised to work with Inuit to ensure that Inuit had the same level of social standard as any other Canadian was when it announced that it would work with Inuit to eliminate tuberculosis in Inuit Nunagat by 2030. In the history of Canada, there had never been a pledge by the government of Canada to do anything like that for Inuit population. We've received $27.5 million for a first iteration of TB elimination work. In our pre-budget submission, ITK for this year put a $141 million ask in for TB elimination work, in addition to a $3.2 billion 10-year housing ask, which is directly related to the TB elimination work. Public health officials, medical experts, everyone within the TB field recognizes the explicit link between overcrowding and the risk for tuberculosis. We need to do more to ensure that we can meet the 2030 target and that we can celebrate Canada's level of commitment and our own level of commitment as Inuit to put this as a priority. So more can be done to ensure that we do the right research that is necessary to understand where tuberculosis intervention needs to be taken place. And also we need to do more to ensure that from the knowledge that we have from a global perspective that we're implementing in the Arctic to ensure that we do all that we can to eliminate TB by 2030.
Thank you, Ms. Sidlaut. Colleagues, I'm going to try to get part of a second round in. Let's go to the second round, and we'll start with Mr. Vidal. Mr. Vidal, you have 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank all our witnesses as well today for your excellent testimony, and I just have a few quick questions that I'll try to get in my time here today. As many of you are probably aware, we just finished a study on on barriers to Indigenous businesses in Indigenous communities. Chief Heyman, you specifically talked about in your opening comments about connections and links, and we've heard a number of discussions today around economic activity. I would suggest that there is a direct link from some of these business successes to the actual housing and infrastructure gap. We heard lots about access to capital. We heard about utilizing own source revenues in a concept called monetization to make an upfront investment in not only just housing, but other infrastructure. So Chief Heyman, if I could start with you, would you comment on the fact that an Indigenous-led solution to not only the housing crisis, but also just the infrastructure gap would be key to your community's pathway to economic prosperity, and maybe kind of some ideas as to what that might look like in your experience, please? I think you're still muted there, Chief, if you don't mind just jumping back in there.
Sorry, can you just repeat the question again?
My question was simply, could you just comment on how an Indigenous-led solution to the investment in housing, also the infrastructure gap, would be key to your community's pathway to economic prosperity, and maybe just some ideas as to what that looks like specifically for your communities?
Okay, so there is definitely a socioeconomic component to this. Own source revenue, government funding, it all will contribute towards finding a global solution. I guess the challenge for us is that while it can create some economic opportunity, it may not solve all of our challenges, but it most certainly is a way to look forward. Again, when we look at the socioeconomic opportunity, we need to move beyond the dependence on social housing. So when we talk about jobs, own source revenue, what that really does is open up opportunities for us to invest directly in our housing, and also for our members to move away from social housing to being eligible for a mortgage, and we begin a conversation talking about home ownership. And it's an important transition that has to happen. But in the meantime, not all communities, are set up in the same way. We have, a real different reality in Quebec, where we have isolated urban and rural communities. And so the economic opportunities are more limited in those remote communities because of lack of jobs, more dependence on social programs. But where we want to explore, this new concept really is in all of the areas. But we know that communities that are in a more urban area where they have access to jobs, we see the different types of housing and opportunities that exist. So again, there's work to be done, but it is part of the solution going forward.
Chief Woodhouse and President Obed, you know what? I've got a really limited amount of time left, so rather than ask a new question, I'm going to ask each of you if you have any kind of comment on that same question that you might want to add to what Chief Heyman already suggested.
Thank you. And thank you for that question. Absolutely. Many times our First Nations communities and many Canadians don't know this, that we're not eligible for mortgages, even if we wanted to. And it can be very frustrating when we're left out of, the economics of our country because of the Indian Act, and we have to ask for a ministerial loan guarantee and all these things. And so, I don't know much more I can add than what Chief Heyman had said. I know he's the expert in his community and for Quebec. And so I'll leave it there. I want to thank you for the time today, for your time. But absolutely, we have a long way to go, and we have a lot of things to learn from each other on moving forward. So I look forward to that, and I look forward to further discussions on many of these issues that can close the gaps that exist between Canadians and First Nations people. Miigwech.
Thank you. President Obed, did you want to comment briefly, or are you okay?
Yes, I'll just jump in briefly. There are a few different components to that, but first and foremost, the majority of Inuit live in social housing. through the Inuit Nunangat housing strategy, we imagine that we are going to have a diverse set of circumstances, and growing a home ownership within our communities is going to help us in fiscal wealth and in economic development. Pushing to end the housing crisis will also allow for community-based businesses, regional businesses, to also benefit and get away from a south-north connection where we get all of our resources and all of the expertise from the south, because we have such a intermittent access to these developments in small communities.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Vidal. Ms. Atwin, you have the floor for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to our witnesses for joining us today. I'm going to use my time to pick up on an issue that my colleague MP Batiste brought up, and it's around limited land. And so, I mean, as the Member of Parliament for Fredericton, I have the honor of representing 2 Indigenous communities, St. Mary's First Nation and Ormukto First Nation. One is an urban community, and the other is in a much smaller kind of municipality, but they both have this issue of limited land as their communities continue to grow. So I'm just wondering, is this a limitation, Mr. Hammond, or Chief Hammond, perhaps I'll address you. Is this a limitation that you're also seeing in Quebec communities and more broadly, perhaps throughout Canada in your role? And if so, what path would you suggest to address this, considering the long and cumbersome addition to reserve process?
It's a good question. Again, I don't want to speak on behalf of all First Nations across the country, because our realities are very different, and there's leadership within those regions who will speak, towards, what they need. But in Quebec, most certainly, we are seeing that land is at a premium, with growing demographics, small communities, meeting housing needs is going to be a challenge. The only current way to increase the size of our communities is the addition to reserves process. And again, it's been reworked, improved. I think the work's still ongoing on this policy. So we need to find a different mousetrap. Additions to reserve will work in certain circumstances. Many First Nations across this country are treaty First Nations. And so, the land that they require, I'm assuming, would be part of those discussions under treaty rights and treaty land entitlement. In Quebec, given the fact that most nations have unceded territories, I think, there's an opportunity that we can expand and improve and increase the size of our communities by sitting down and having discussions with Crown Indigenous relations about recognizing our rights and title, rather than going through a comprehensive claim process, a specific claims process, the additions to reserve. We, believe that is a viable opportunity. But again, it takes political will, and there's a third player that has to, come into this discussion, and that's the province, who, reluctant, will not get involved in most instances. What they like to do when we talk about housing needs, and particularly of our urban members, is just simply shrug it off and say it's a federal responsibility. But again, there's opportunities to expand our land bases in working in collaboration with the province and the federal government, and quit being dependent on, additions to reserve and these other processes, which are complex, take time, and are, have a huge host of challenges.
Miigwech, Chief. And for President Obed, for the Inuit Nunangat housing strategy, just wondering, what role does the Inuit Crown Partnership Committee play in measuring progress on the strategy? And if you have any just kind of general comments around progress or lack thereof, thank you.
We do have a mechanism within the Inuit Crown Partnership Committee process where once a year we reflect on the work that we have done to date and the progress that we have made. On this particular strategy, there has not been as much progress made as we would have hoped. Part of that is because of the pandemic and because of the penultimate focus of the Government of Canada and on Inuit leadership on COVID response over the last 2 years. But there still is a lot of work to do, and we have committees in place, and we're working through some of these challenges to ensure that we get the most out of all federal departments who have anything to do with the housing continuum. Too often, we are told to go directly to Indigenous services in relation to housing, when we know that CMHC has a wealth of experience in data collecting and summaries, in understanding the housing market and the different parts of the housing market. So it isn't just a dollars and cents money situation that we're looking for. We are looking for the full breadth of knowledge that the federal government has to be applied to working on interventions to end the housing crisis for Inuit Nunangat.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Ms. Adwin. We'll now go to Madame Gill pour 2 minutes et demie.
For 2.5 minutes. Thank you, Chair. So I would like to turn over the floor to Chief Amon, perhaps for the remaining seconds, if he has something that he would like to add regarding solutions, of course, or issues, or if he wishes to perhaps talk to us about his main recommendations. Thank you.
Thank you, Madame Gill. I think I would just kind of reiterate, what we had spoken about. The state of housing, situation, as we identified, presents, several challenges, but it also offers us a share of opportunities. We spoke about the socioeconomic impacts that could happen in the event that the federal government funded the catch-up project that we have, been discussing. The links between housing and other spheres of society, have been demonstrated that investing heavily in First Nation housing could benefit, us in other areas, especially in stimulating the economy and addressing, some of the social ills and future social development of our community. Our figures also show that every time the federal government has made additional investments in housing, like the Canada's Economic Action Plan, the impact is visible on the core needs. We can demonstrate in Quebec that it reduces core need, which means that the impacts are being felt locally. So I guess my final message is that, we need stable, predictable funding, and the current funding levels are insufficient to meet our needs. When we're telling you we need to build 1,000 to 2,000 units per year, and the current funding level only allows us to do 245. It speaks to a huge gap. And then when you take the data that Regional Chief Woodhouse spoke about that has been collected, over the past couple of years diligently by the AFN, so we have a picture of a national portrait, you get a clear sense of the scope of the issue. Again, I think, for Quebec, home ownership is part of our solution, but not for all communities. And, we need to work and find different tools. Regional Chief Woodhouse spoke of ministerial loan guarantees. Here in Quebec, many First Nations do not require ministerial loan guarantees, as they have been able to establish relationships with banking institutions like the Royal Bank, Bank of Montreal, where the banks, work with the communities to provide mortgages, for our members who have the ability to repay. And subsequently, we moved the spectrum from dependence on social housing towards one where we have a mix of social housing for those in need and home ownership for those who can afford. So again, thank you very much, Madame Gill, other members of the committee, for inviting myself and the Assembly of First Nations of Quebec and Labrador, to speak about the challenges, but more importantly, the opportunities and the plan that we've developed. I can sit here and, be very critical of the government and Indigenous services and CMHC. but that's not helpful if we only criticize and we don't bring forward, viable options and solutions that specifically meet the realities of First Nations here in Quebec. Thank you.
Thank you, Chief Heyman. Merci, Madame Gill.
Thank you, Ms. Gill.
Madame Idlaut. Madame Idlaut.
Thank you. First, I'd like to ask Nathan, and the other two speakers can reply to it as well. Are you confident that if the federal government continues its current approach to developing housing in Nunavut, that there will be a significant difference in housing conditions within the next few years?
I'm so sorry to interrupt you. I'll just say my question in English. What specific recommendations do you have to change the colonial policies that you mentioned in your presentation?
My apologies, Lori. First and foremost, the distinctions-based way that this government can work with First Nations, Inuit, and Métis, and also empowering Inuit self-determination as a part of these solutions will go a long way towards getting to a better place when it comes to the respect for housing and respect for Indigenous peoples. I also think that recognizing this as a national crisis and understanding that it is the obligation of the Government of Canada as fulfilling not only the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, but also the international human right to housing, that all of that comes into play as well when it comes to what we need to do for Inuit here in this country in regards to housing.
Thank you very much, Ms. Idlaut. That concludes our second panel. I would like to thank Regional Chief Cindy Woodhouse. I would like to thank Chief Lance Haymond, as well as President Nathan Obed, for appearing before our committee today and providing their insights on a very urgent subject. Certainly one, to quote one of you who said, basically it's the root cause of a great deal of many other challenges. So we very much appreciate your appearance today. Thank you very much. And thank you, committee members. Our meeting today is now adjourned. Thank you.